Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery here with more of your favorite imperialist, plant hunter, and botanist extraordinaire, Mr. Robert Fortune. We rejoin him on this, his second adventure in China. His first trip, July 1843 to May 1846, for the London Botanical Society, took him all over the treaty ports and lands adjacent to there. This time we're reading from his second book, Journey to the Tea Countries of China. That was published in 1852. Here, Robert Fortune tells the story of the trip he made in the employ of the British East India Company. This was from 1849 to 1851. And then, this book we'll be reading from today came out in 1852. The company had this idea to steal tea plants, seeds, and technology from China and transplant that to their experimental tea farms in the Himalayas. Now, those experimental farms were managed by brilliant naturalists, just like Fortune. So the British had everything covered as far as launching a large-scale tea industry in India, except for the seeds and the know-how to turn those leaves into the quality of black tea that they just couldn't survive without in the home country. They had had some minor success growing tea in India, but after so much effort, the experts said it still wasn't up to par with the stuff they were buying out of China. So in this episode, Fortune is on his way to the place where, word had it, the finest green teas in all of China came from, the Huangshan region of southern Anhui province. They weren't wrong about that. I won't go so far as to say the teas from there are the best, but they're pretty damn good. You remember from that History of Tea series, Huangshan Maofeng? Well, Fortune was bound for that region. He had left Shanghai and was sailing down the Qiantang River and other tributaries of this wonder of nature. This river used to be called the Zhe River. That's how Zhejiang got its name. Not many people know that, so keep it quiet. This is the river where you can witness the famous tidal bore at Hangzhou. You could see it on YouTube also, if you can get access to it. I think there's a few million Qiantang tidal bore videos also on Youku and Tudou as well. In this episode, Fortune travels through the watered world of Jiangsu and Zhejiang, passing through the Lake Tai region, Taihu, Hangzhou, including West Lake, and other towns along the rivers and tributaries he traversed. Well, good old RF is living the life, being the man. He vents plenty about his contempt for his servant. This person, surnamed Wang, is quite a character, and Fortune is already fed up with this guy even before they get to where they're going. But he keeps him on. I mean, RF was trying to lay low in the country. Foreigners weren't supposed to be where he was. He was traveling around incognito, in disguise, and Wang, though warned to keep everything on the QT, just can't stop himself from letting others in on the secret. Fortune thought he was fooling everyone with his pinned-on queue, his head-shaved Manchu style, and wearing this Chinese garb. I don't know, maybe he did. But if you ask me, if you see a big hairy white guy dressed up as a Chinese, I bet he looked about as Chinese as Peter Sellers and Warner Oland. This would be quite a risky and dangerous adventure Robert Fortune took part in. He was completely off the grid. Anyone could have murdered him along the way, and no one would have been the wiser. So despite his good-natured contempt for the low-born Chinese, as he calls them, I really have to take my hat off to him. I don't know if I would have had the guts to do what he was doing, in the 19th century, that is. Anyway, sit back and enjoy this passage that speaks to you from 1849. Zachary Taylor had just taken the presidential oath. Ireland was still in the middle of their Great Famine. 168 years ago from our 2017 vantage point. Leaving the old town behind us and sailing westward, we entered a broad sheet of water of considerable size, which is probably part of, or at least joins, the celebrated Taihu Lake. The water is very shallow, and a great part of it is covered with Trapa bicornis, a plant called ling by the Chinese. It produces a fruit of a very peculiar shape, resembling the head and horns of a bullock, and is highly esteemed in all parts of the empire. I have seen 3 distinct species or varieties, one of which has a fruit of a beautiful red color. Women and boys were sailing about on all parts of the lake in tubs of the same size and form as our common washing tubs, gathering the fruit of the ling. I don't know of any contrivance which would have answered their purpose better than these rude tubs, for they held the fruit as it was gathered as well as the gatherer, and at the same time were easily propelled through the masses of ling without doing the plants any injury. The sight of a number of people swimming about on the lake, each in his tub, has something very ludicrous about it. After we had passed the lake, the banks of the canal, and indeed the greater part of the country, were covered with mulberry trees. Silk is evidently the staple production in this part of China. During the space of 2 days, and in that time I must have traveled upwards of 100 miles, I saw little else than mulberry trees. They were evidently carefully cultivated, and in the highest state of health, producing fine, large, and glossy leaves. When it is remembered that I was going in a straight direction through the country, some idea may be formed of the extent of this enormous silk district, which probably occupies a circle of at least 100 miles in diameter. And this, it must be remembered, is only one of the silk districts in China. But it is the principal and the best one. The merchant and manufacturer will form a good idea of the quantity of silk consumed in China when told that, after the war, on the port of Shanghai being opened, the exports of raw silk increased in 2 or 3 years from 3,000 to 20,000 bales. This fact shows, I think, the enormous quantity which must have been in the Chinese market before the extra demand could have been so easily supplied. But as it is with tea, so it is with silk. The quantity exported bears but a small proportion to that consumed by the Chinese themselves. The 17,000 extra bales sent yearly out of the country have not, in the least degree, affected the price of raw silk or of silk manufactures. This fact speaks for itself. Shimenyuan, a town about 140 li northeast from Hangzhou, was the next place of any note which I passed. It is apparently a very ancient city, but has no trade, and is altogether in a most dilapidated condition. The walls were completely overrun with wild shrubs, and in many places were crumbling into ruins. It had evidently seen better and more prosperous days, which had long ago passed by. The boatmen informed me that this part of the country abounded in thieves and robbers, and that they must not all go to bed at night, otherwise something would be stolen from the boat before morning. We reached the city about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The morning had been cold and rainy, and the boatmen, who were all wet to the skin, refused to proceed further that day. I was therefore obliged to make up my mind to stay there all that night, and a more disagreeable one I never spent. After dark, my servants and the boatmen told stories of celebrated pirates and robbers until they frightened themselves and almost made me believe myself to be in dangerous company. The wind was very high, and as it whistled amongst the ruinous ramparts, the sound was dismal enough. And what added still more to our discomfort, the rain beat through the roof of our boat and kept dripping upon our beds. Before retiring to sleep, it had been arranged that my coolie and one of the boatmen were to sit and keep watch during the night for our protection from thieves. The coolie's station was inside the boat, where I was, and the other man was to keep watch in the after part of the boat, where the cooking department was carried on. How long these sentries kept watch, I cannot tell, but when I awoke, sometime before the morning dawned, the dangers of the place seemed to be completely forgotten, except perhaps in their dreams, for I found them sound asleep. The other men were also sleeping heavily, and no one seemed to have harmed us during our slumbers. I now roused the whole of them, and, the morning being fine, we proceeded on our journey towards the city of Hangzhou. During this 3 days' journey, we had been passing through a perfectly level country, having seen only 3 or 4 small hills near the city of Zhejiang. Now, however, the scene began to change, and the hills, which gird this extensive plain on the west and southwest sides, came into view. The appearance of the flat country here was rich and beautiful. Still, the mulberry was seen extensively cultivated on all the higher patches of ground, and rice occupied the low wetland. As we approached Hangzhou, the vegetation of the country was richer and under a higher state of cultivation than any which had come under my notice in other parts of China. It reminded me of the appearance which those highly cultivated spots present near our large market towns in England. The country around Hangzhou may well be called the Garden of China. The Grand Canal, with its numerous branches, not only waters it, but also affords the means of traveling through it and of conveying the productions for which it is famous to other districts. The hills in the background, the beautiful bay which comes up to the town and stretches far away towards the ocean, and the noble river which here falls into the bay, all contribute to render the scenery strikingly beautiful. On the evening of the 22nd of October, I approached the suburbs of Hangzhou, one of the largest and most flourishing cities in the richest district of the Chinese Empire. The Chinese authorities have always been most jealous of foreigners approaching or entering this town. It is generally supposed that, in addition to the natural antipathy which they manifest to the outside barbarians, they have a customs house here in which they levy duties on merchandise imported or exported by foreigners, which duties are opposed to the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing. They know well enough that, if foreigners were allowed to come here, this system of extortion would soon be exposed and broken up. As I drew nearer the city, everything which came under my observation marked it as a place of great importance. The Grand Canal was deep and wide, and bore on its waters many hundreds of boats of different sizes, all engaged in an active and bustling trade. Many of these were sailing in the same direction as ourselves, whilst others were leaving the city and hurrying onwards in the direction of Suzhou, Huzhou, Jiaxing, and other towns. Canals were seen branching off from the Grand Canal in all directions and forming the high roads of the country. When I reached the end of this part of my journey, my boatmen drew up and moored the boat amongst the thousands of the same class, and, it being now nearly dark, I determined to rest there for the night. When the next morning dawned and I had time to take a survey of our position, I found that we had been moored on the edge of a large, broad basin of water, which terminates the Grand Canal. As I had nothing to do in the city and merely wanted to pass onwards on my journey to the green tea country, I did not wish to run the risk of passing through it. Before leaving Shanghai, when consulting the map and fixing my route, I asked if it were possible to get to the mouth of the Hangzhou River without actually passing through the city itself. Both my men informed me that this was quite easy, and even protested strongly against my entering the town. They said we should go by the Shihu Lake, at which place we could leave the Shanghai boat and then proceed on foot or in chairs a distance of 30 li. By this means we should merely skirt the town and attain the object we had in view. This plan seemed feasible enough. When we reached the suburbs of Hangzhou, therefore, not knowing the locality, I naturally supposed that we were at Shihu, which is only part of the suburbs. This, however, was not the case. Wang, who had been sent on shore at daybreak to procure a chair and coolies for our luggage, now came back and informed me that he had succeeded in arranging all this at an inn hard by, to which we must now go. Leaving the boat, we walked up a crowded street for nearly a quarter of a mile, and then entered the inn in question. No one took the slightest notice of me, a circumstance which gave me a good deal of confidence, and led me to conclude that I was dressed in a proper manner, and that I made a pretty good Chinaman. Our Shanghai boatmen accompanied us, carrying our luggage. Indeed, I believe they had recommended us to the inn at which we had now arrived. To my astonishment, they at once informed their friend, the innkeeper, that I was a foreigner. Having been paid their fare, they had nothing more to expect, and I suppose could not contain the secret any longer. I now expected that some difficulties would be experienced in procuring a chair, either through fear of the mandarins or with the view of extorting money. The old man, who made his living by letting chairs and selling tea, took everything very quietly and did not seem to despise a good customer, even if he was a foreigner. A chair was soon ready for me to proceed on my journey. The bearers were paid by the master of the house to take me one stage, about halfway, and a sum of money was given them to engage another chair for the remainder of the journey, to a place called Ganpu, which is situated on the banks of the large river which here falls into the Bay of Hangzhou. Everything being satisfactorily arranged, I stepped into the chair, and desiring my two servants to follow me, proceeded along the narrow streets at a rapid pace. After traveling in this way for about a mile, and expecting every moment to get out into the open country, I was greatly surprised by finding that I was getting more and more into a dense town. For the first time, I began to suspect that my servants were deceiving me and that I was to pass through the city of Hangzhou after all. These suspicions were soon confirmed by the appearance of the walls and ramparts of the city. It was now too late to object to this procedure, and I thought the best way to act was to let matters take their own course and remain passive in this business. We passed through the gates into the city. It seemed an ancient place. The walls and ramparts were high and in excellent repair, and the gates were guarded, as usual, by a number of soldiers. Its main street, through which I passed, is narrow when compared with streets in European towns, but it is well paved and reminded me of the main street of Ningbo. Hangzhou, however, is a place of much greater importance than Ningbo, both in a political and mercantile point of view. It is the chief town of the Zhejiang province and is the residence of many of the principal mandarins and officers of the government, as well as of many of the great merchants. It has been remarked, not unfrequently, when comparing the towns of Shanghai and Ningbo, that the former is a trading place and the latter a place of great wealth. Hangzhou has both these advantages combined. Besides, it is a fashionable place and is to the province of Zhejiang what Suzhou is to Jiangnan. Du Halde quotes an old proverb which significantly says that, quote, "Paradise is above, but below are Suzhou and Hangzhou." The walls of this territorial paradise are said to be 40 li in circumference, that is, about 8 English miles. Although there are a great many gardens and open spaces inside, yet the extent of the city is very great, and in many parts of the population is most dense. The suburbs also are very extensive and must contain a very large population. Sir George Staunton supposed that the population of the city and suburbs was equal to that of Beijing, and Du Halde estimates it at 1 million souls. The houses bear a striking resemblance to those of Ningbo, Suzhou, and other northern towns. Were I set down blindfolded in the main street of one of these Chinese towns, even in one which I knew well, and the bandage removed from my eyes, I should have great difficulty in saying where I was. There are doubtless distinctions with which the barbarian eye is unacquainted, but which would be plain enough to a Chinese. I observed in many parts of the city triumphal arches, monuments to great men, and gorgeous-looking Buddhist temples. But although these buildings have a certain degree of interest about them, and many of them are certainly curious, yet as works of art they are not to be compared with the buildings of the same class which one meets with at home. The shops in the main streets have their fronts entirely removed by day, so that the passenger may have an opportunity of seeing and of forming a good idea of the wares which are for sale. I observed many shops where gold and silver ornaments and valuable jade stone were exposed for sale. Old curiosity shops were numerous and contained articles of great value amongst the Chinese, such as ancient porcelain jars, bronzes, carved bamboo, jars cut out of the beautiful jade stone, and a variety of other things of like description. I observed some large silk shops as I passed along, and, judging from the number of people in the town who wear silk dresses, they must have a thriving trade. Everything, indeed, which met the eye stamped Hangzhou as a place of wealth and luxury. As usual in all the Chinese towns which I have visited, there were a vast number of tea and eating houses for the middle classes and the poor. They did not seem to lack customers, for they were all crowded with hundreds of natives who, for a few cash or qian, can obtain a healthy and substantial meal. Besides the officers of government, merchants, shopkeepers, and common laborers connected with all these professions, the city contains a large manufacturing population. Silk is the staple article of manufacture. Du Halde estimates the numbers engaged in this operation at 60,000. I observed a great number employed in the reeling process, and others were busily engaged with the beautiful embroidery for which this part of China is so famous. The people of Hangzhou dress gaily and are remarkable amongst the Chinese for their dandyism. All except the lowest laborers and coolies strutted about in dresses composed of silk, satin, and crepe. My Chinese servants were one day contrasting the natives of Hangzhou in this respect with those of the more inland parts from which they came. They said there were many rich men in their country, but they all dressed plainly and modestly, while the natives of Hangzhou, both rich and poor, were never contented unless gaily dressed in silks and satins. "Indeed," said they, "one can never tell a rich man in Hangzhou, for it is just possible that all he possesses in the world is on his back." When we were about halfway through the city, the chairman set me down and informed me that they went no further. I got out and looked round for my servants, from whom I expected an explanation, for I had understood that the chairman had been paid to take me the whole way through. My servants, however, were nowhere to be seen. They had either gone some other road or, what was more probable, had intentionally kept out of the way in case of any disturbance. I was now in a dilemma and did not clearly see my way out of it. Much to my surprise and pleasure, however, another chair was brought me, and I was informed that I was to proceed in it. I now understood how the business had been managed. The innkeeper had entrusted the first bearers with a sum of money sufficient to hire another chair for the second stage of the journey. Part of this sum, however, had been spent by them in tea and tobacco as we came along, and the second bearers could not be induced to take me on for the sum which was left. A brawl now ensued between the two sets of chairmen, which was noisy enough, though. But as such things are quite common in China, it seemed fortunately for me to attract but little notice. The situation in which I was now placed was rather critical and far from an enviable one. Had it been known that a foreigner was in the very heart of the city of Hangzhou, a mob would have soon collected, and the consequences might have been serious. "Take things coolly and never lose your temper" should be the motto of everyone who attempts to travel in China. This is always the best plan, for if you allow things to take their course, 10 to 1 you will get out of a dilemma like that in which I was now placed, and if you attempt to interfere, you will probably make matters worse. These were the principles in which I generally acted, but in the present instance I was not allowed to carry them out to their fullest extent. I had taken my seat in the second chair and was patiently waiting until such time as the first men could give the second satisfactory reasons for spending part of their cash in tea and tobacco. The first notice, however, which I received of the unsuccessful result of this attempt was an intimation that I was to be ejected from the chair. I knew this would not do, as from my imperfect knowledge of the language I might have some difficulty in finding another conveyance, and I did not know 1 foot of the way which I was going. I was therefore obliged to inquire into the dispute and put an end to it by promising to pay the difference when we arrived at the end of our stage. This was evidently what the first rascals had been calculating upon, but it had the effect of stopping all further disputes, and my bearers shouldered their burden and jogged onwards. The distance from the basin of the Grand Canal to the river on the opposite side is 28 or 30 li, between 5 and 6 miles. After leaving the city behind us, we passed through a pretty undulating country for about 2 miles and then entered the town of Ganpu, which is built along the banks of the river Qiantang, sometimes called the Green River, which here falls into the Bay of Hangzhou. Ganpu is the seaport of Hangzhou. I had seen nothing of my servants during the whole way and was beginning to expect a scene or adventure at the end of this part of the journey. The chair-bearers spoke a peculiar dialect which I could scarcely make out, and I kept wondering as we went along what would happen next. The only thing I could make out was that they were taking me to a hongle, but what a hongle was way beyond my comprehension. To carry out my own principles and trust to circumstances seemed to be the only way of proceeding, and I gave myself very little uneasiness about the result. At length I heard the men say that here was the hongle, and as I was about to look and see what this might be, the chair was set down, and it was intimated to me that we had reached the end of the journey. Greatly to my surprise and pleasure, I now found that this hongle was a quiet and comfortable Chinese inn, which was frequented by passengers from all parts of the country. Getting out of my chair, I walked quietly up to the farther end of the large hall, and began to look amongst a number of packages, which were heaped up there from my own luggage. I had seen nothing of either that or my servant since I left the former inn. It had arrived, however, quite safely, having been sent on by a coolie before me, and in a few minutes my 2 men also made their appearance. We now informed the innkeeper that we wanted to go upriver to Huizhou and made inquiries regarding a boat. We soon found that it was part of his trade to give chops or to secure boatmen. Everything is done upon this plan in China. When a servant is engaged or a boat hired, it is always necessary for the said servant or boatman to produce some respectable householder who, for a certain sum, becomes bound for him in a written chop or agreement. This chop is handed over to the master of the servant or to the hirer of the boat, who retains it until his contract is satisfactorily fulfilled. This system is practiced universally amongst the Chinese, who seem to have no faith in the lower orders of the people. I quickly dispatched Wang to look after a boat and desired him to bring the boatmen with him to the inn to have his agreement drawn up and signed. The other man ran out along with them, and I was again left in a strange place among strangers. The inn in which I was located was a large old building, pleasantly situated on the banks of the Green River. All the lower part formed a sort of shed or warehouse, which was filled with goods of various kinds and the luggage of passengers. At the upper end of this apartment, a table was placed in the middle of the floor and served for the host and his guests to dine upon. Around this table were sitting 5 or 6 respectable-looking Chinese merchants, smoking from long bamboo pipes and discussing the news of the day and the state of trade. These men politely made way for me at the table. I took the seat offered, and to be neighbor-like, commenced smoking as fast as any of them. In other parts of the warehouse, the servants of these men and other traveling servants were lolling about or sound asleep upon the chairs or goods. No one seemed to take any particular notice of me, and I soon sat perfectly at my ease. A little incident happened which gave me some uneasiness at the time, but at which I have often had a good laugh since. Preparations began to be made for dinner, and the travelers who were seated around the table arose and wandered about the other parts of the house. It was midday, and as I had eaten no breakfast, I felt rather hungry. In these circumstances, it may be thought that the appearance of dinner would have afforded me some pleasure. This, however, was not the case, and for the following reason: I had not eaten with chopsticks for 3 years, and I had no confidence in my talents and the use of them. This important circumstance had not struck me before. Otherwise, I would have practiced all the way from Shanghai to Hangzhou and might have been proficient by this time. As it was, I was quite certain that I should draw the eyes of Chinamen upon me, for nothing would astonish them so much as a person using the chopsticks in an awkward manner. I was therefore obliged, reluctantly I confess, to abandon all ideas of a dinner on that day. Meanwhile, the dishes were placed upon the table, and the guests were called by their names and requested to sit down. Xinghua, Xinghua, the name I bore amongst the Chinese. Come and sit down to dinner. I felt much inclined to break my resolution and sit down, but prudence came to my aid, and I replied, "No, I thank you. I shall dine by and by, when my servants come back." I believe it is common enough for travelers to dine at different hours and in different ways according to circumstances, so that my refusal did not seem to attract much notice. A short time afterwards, my servants returned, bringing a boatman with them to have a chop made out and to have him secured by the innkeeper. As soon as this was done to our satisfaction, we left the inn and walked down to the boat, which lay alongside one of the wharfs at the riverside. Several other passengers had also arrived, and we were all to sleep on board, as the boat was to start at daybreak on the following morning. To me, this had been an exciting and adventurous day, and I was not sorry when the darkness closed around us, and we all retired to rest. The river Qiantang, on which I was now, has its sources far away amongst the mountains to the westward. One of its branches rises amongst the green tea hills of Huizhou, another near to the town of Changshan, on the borders of Jiangxi, and a third on the northern side of the Bohei Mountains. These streams unite in their course to the eastward, and, passing Hangzhou, fall into the bay which bears the same name. All the green and black tea comes down this river on its way to Shanghai, and at Hangzhou is transshipped from riverboats into those which ply upon the Grand Canal. The importance of Hangzhou, in a mercantile point of view, is therefore very great. All goods from the south and westward must of necessity pass through this town on their way to the large and populous districts about Suzhou, Zhejiang, and Shanghai. In the same manner, all foreign imports and the products of the Low Countries, such as silk and cotton, in going to the southward and westward, must also pass through Hangzhou. It therefore appears to be like a great gate on a public highway through which nothing can pass or repass without the consent and cognizance of the authorities. The power which this place gives the Chinese authorities over our imports and exports through Shanghai is very great, and hence complaints of stoppages and illegal charges or squeezes have been not unfrequent. The day cannot be very far distant when we shall be allowed to trade and travel in China as in other countries, when all those foolish regulations regarding boundary lines will be swept away. But in the event of these changes being gradual, it may be a question whether our government should not endeavor to open the town of Hangzhou, at all events have a consular agent there for the encouragement and protection of our trade. When the next morning dawned, we got under way and stared out into the river, which is here 3 or 4 miles in width. The boat was strongly built, flat-bottomed, and very sharp, both fore and aft. Ordinary boats, such as those seen at Shanghai, would be perfectly useless here, for they would soon be broken to pieces on the rocks and stones which abound in this shallow but rapid river. We were deeply laden with cargo and carried about 20 passengers. The cargo was packed in the bottom of the boat and the passengers above it. 2 rows of sleeping berths were constructed along each side of the boat, and a passage between them, so that both passengers and boatmen could walk from stem to stern without any inconvenience. The first-class passengers occupied the side berths, and their servants and coolies slept in the passage. A Chinese bed is not a very luxurious one. It consists simply of a mat to lie upon, a hard square pillow for the head, and a coverlet stuffed with cotton to draw over the body as protection from the cold. I had the berth nearest the stern of the boat. A dwarf occupied the one opposite, and my 2 servants slept in the passage between us. The galley, or I should say cooking apparatus, was placed outside in the stern, near to the steersman. Each passenger, when he takes his passage in these boats, agrees for 3 meals a day at a certain fixed rate. We were to have congee in the morning, rice at midday, and rice congee again in the evening. Anything else the passengers wanted, such as tea, fish, meat, or vegetables, they had to provide and cook for themselves. The arrangement seems a good one, and it enables those who are so inclined to travel at a very small cost. Many of the passengers had nothing else than what was provided by the boatmen, excepting perhaps a little tea, which they all carried with them, and which in this country is cheap enough. In the morning, a basin of hot water with a cloth in it was brought to me to perform my ablutions. The following is the Chinese way of using this. The cloth is dipped in the hot water and then wrung until the greater part of the water is pressed out. In this hot and damp state, it is spread out on both hands, and the face, neck, and head rubbed over with it. This mode of washing is not the most effectual, but there is nothing more refreshing on a warm day if one comes in from a walk hot and weary. It is far more refreshing than bathing in cold water, and perhaps more conducive to health. After I was dressed, I received a cup of tea in the strict sense of the word, without sugar or milk, these additions never being used in this part of China. About 8 o'clock, the cook had 6 large earthenware basins placed at the side of the rice pot. Each of these he filled brim full of congee and set them in the open air to cool. When it was cool enough to be eaten, the basins were placed in a row in the passage between our berths. The passengers then arranged themselves into messes, 4 in each, and breakfast began. By this arrangement, the dwarf, who occupied the berth opposite to mine, my 2 Chinese servants, and myself, formed the mess nearest to the stern of the boat. Each man was furnished with a small basin and a pair of chopsticks. A wooden ladle was placed in the earthen pan, with which each filled his basin. Having had little to eat the day before, except some sweet potatoes which one of my men brought me, I was hungry enough not only to eat the congee, uninviting as it certainly was, but also to disregard the presence of the Chinese, or what they might think of the awkward way in which I used the chopsticks. I got on very well, however, and found that I had not quite forgotten the art of eating with these highly civilized instruments. It is, however, easier to eat rice and congee with them than other kinds of food, for the basin is generally brought quite close up to the mouth, and its contents partly sucked and partly shoveled in. The tide and wind were both fair, so that we glided up the river with great rapidity. It was a beautiful autumnal day, and the scene altogether was a most charming one. We had left behind us the great plain of the Zhejiang, and the country was now hilly and most romantic. Buddhist temples and pagodas were observed here and there, rising high above the trees. One of the latter is called Leifeng Ta, or the Temple of the Thundering Winds. It stands on the borders of the Shihu Lake, and appeared to be a very ancient edifice. Wild briars and other weeds were growing out of its walls, even up to its very summit, and it was evidently fast going to decay. It formed a striking feature in the landscape and reminded me of those ancient castle ruins which are so common on the borders of England and Scotland. At night, when it became too dark to see our course, the boat was anchored abreast of a small village until the following morning, when we again got under way. We were now 40 or 50 miles to the southwest of Hangzhou. The hills here had not that rich appearance which those nearer the sea had presented, but they were far more striking in their formation. The sides were ridged and furrowed in a most remarkable manner, and their summits broken up into many curious peaks and cones. Some were low, others were 3,000 or 4,000 feet in height, and all were rugged, barren, and wild. The river now became narrow, shallow, and in many parts very rapid. Near Hangzhou, the country seemed densely populated, but up here there was so little ground capable of cultivation that a numerous population could find no subsistence. We only passed 2 towns of any note, named Fuyang and Tonglu, all the way from Hangzhou to Yanzhou, a distance of 380 li. The people in the villages against these hills seemed to earn a scanty subsistence by cutting firewood and sending it down the lowland towns for sale. My fellow passengers, who were chiefly merchants and servants, were quiet and inoffensive. Indeed, they did little else but loll in bed and sleep, except when they were eating or smoking. One of them was a confirmed opium smoker, and the intoxicating drug had made him a perfect slave. I have seen many opium smokers in my travels, but this one was the most pitiable of them all. He was evidently a man of some standing in society and had plenty of money. His bed was surrounded with silk curtains, his pillows were beautifully embroidered, and his coverlet was of the richest and softest satin. Everything about him told of luxury and sensual pleasures. But let me take a peep inside his bed curtains and describe what I saw on the first day of our acquaintance. The curtains were down and drawn close round, particularly on that side from which the wind came. He was clothed in the finest silks, and had lain down on his side upon a mat. His head was resting on one of the embroidered pillows. A small lamp was burning by his side. An opium pipe was in his mouth, and he was inhaling the intoxicating fumes. After smoking for a few minutes, he began to have the appearance which a drunken man presents in the first stage of intoxication. The fumes had done their work, and he was now in his third heaven of bliss. In a minute or two, he jumped up and called for his teapot, from which he took a good draught of tea. He then walked about the boat, evidently a good deal excited, and talked and joked with everyone he met. After spending some time in this manner, he began to smoke tobacco. He then took another draught out of his teapot, and lay down to sleep. But his slumbers were not of long duration, and were evidently disturbed by strange and frightful dreams. He awoke at last, but it was only to renew the dose as before, and so on from day to day. Even in the silent night, when all around was sunk in repose, his craving for the stimulant was beyond his feeble powers of resistance. Often during this passage, when I happened to awake during the night, I could see his little lamp burning and could smell the sickening fumes as they curled about the roof of the boat. The effects which the immoderate use of opium had produced upon this man were of the most melancholy kind. His figure was thin and emaciated, his cheeks had a pale and haggard hue, and his skin had that peculiar glassy polish by which an opium smoker is invariably known. His days were evidently numbered, and yet, strange to tell, this man tried to convince others, and himself also, that he was smoking medicinally and that the use of opium was indispensable to his health. As I looked upon him in these moments of excitement, I could not help feeling what a piteous object is man, the Lord of creation and noblest work of God, when sensual pleasures and enjoyments take such a hold upon him as they had upon this poor opium smoker. During the first day, all the passengers looked upon me as one of themselves, and I fancied I had become a very fair Chinaman. But my coolie, who was a silly, talkative fellow, imagined he was in possession of a secret, and doubtless felt the weight of it rather uncomfortable. I observed him once or twice in close conversation with one of the boatmen, and it turned out afterwards that he told this man, as a great secret of course, that I was a foreigner, one of those Hongmaos who were so numerous in Shanghai. By and by, the secret began to ooze out, and both boatmen and passengers were taking sly peeps at me when they thought I did not see them. Suspecting that all was not right, I called Wang aside and asked him how it was that I had become all at once such an object of interest. "Oh," he said, "that coolie, he is too much a fool-o. He have talkie all that man you no belong this country. You more better send he go away. Suppose you no want ye too much bobly. In plain English, he informed me that the coolie was a fool, that he had told all the people that I was a foreigner, and that I had better send him away if I did not wish to have a disturbance. It was too true. My secret was such no longer. I felt much inclined to punish the coolie for his conduct, and he had to thank the peculiar circumstances in which I was placed for getting off scot-free. I believe the poor fellow was sufficiently punished afterwards by his own countrymen, who thought they had him, to a certain extent, in their power. Nothing more occurred worthy of notice until we arrived at the city of Yenzhou, a town about 380 li from Hangzhou. It is walled and fortified in the same manner as all Chinese towns. The walls are fully 4 miles in circumference. It seems an ancient place, but judging from the small number of boats moored in the river opposite, I should not imagine it of much importance as a place of trade. A considerable quantity of rough lacquered ware is manufactured here, and sold much cheaper than in the towns nearer to the sea. It is a place of call for all the Huizhou boats, and a considerable trade is carried on in all the common necessaries of life. Judging from its size, it may contain about 200,000 inhabitants. They do not seem so rich, or at all events they are not so gaily dressed as their neighbors in Hangzhou. A little below the town there are 2 very pretty pagodas. One of these is built on a curious conical hill, and is named the Hulongta. Here the river divides, or I should rather say 2 streams unite, one of which comes down from the southward, taking its rise partly on the borders of Jiangxi and Jiangnan, and partly on the northern sides of the great Bohai Mountains. To this I may return afterwards. In the meantime I went to the northern branch, which comes down from the green tea country of Huizhou. The hills above Yenzhou are barren, but the valleys and lowlands are rich and fertile. This city is considered halfway between Hangzhou and Huizhou, and our boatmen seem to think themselves entitled to make it serve the purpose of a halfway house, at which they could remain some time. Moreover, the river had increased much in rapidity, and it was necessary to add considerably to the number of our crew. 2 days were spent here in making these arrangements and in making various purchases, such as straw shoes for the men, rice to serve us during the remainder of the journey, and also articles which could sell at a profit further up the country. I did not regret this delay, as it gave me an opportunity of seeing the old town, as well as a portion of the country which was entirely new to me. During our stay here, my servant Wang, who was a foolish, obstinate man, nearly got us all into a very serious scrape. It seemed he had given one of our boatmen a bad dollar in payment of a debt, which the latter brought back, not being able to pass it in the town. In the meantime, Wang had been indulging in a little samshu, a Chinese spirit, and was in a very excited state when the dollar was brought back. He affirmed that it was not the same one he had given the boatmen, and that he would have nothing to do with it. After some altercation, however, he took it back and set off into the city, as he said, to change it himself. In a few minutes he returned with $1 worth of copper cash strung over his shoulders, exclaiming in triumph that the dollar was good enough and that he had found no difficulty in passing it, although the fool of a boatman had. He now threw down the $1 worth of cash to the other, and asked him, in an enraged and excited manner, if he was satisfied now. The latter took up the strings of cash very quietly and began counting and examining them. In a second or two he returned them, saying that they were so mixed and inferior that it would be impossible to pay them away, except at a considerable loss, and that he would not receive them. He again demanded to be paid in good and perfect coin. Wang now pretended to be very indignant. "I gave you $1, said he, and you said that was bad. I changed it and gave you copper cash, and you returned them. Pray, what do you want?" The passengers now gathered round them, and there was every prospect of a serious riot. After a great deal of noise, however, the poor fellow pocketed his cash, protesting at the same time that he had been badly used and threatening to have his revenge on Wang at some future time. At the end of 2 days, the additional men having been engaged and all the purchases completed, we passed up the river and left the town of Yenzhou behind us. Our course was now in a northwesterly direction. The stream was very rapid in many parts, so much so that it is used for turning the water wheels which grind and husk rice and other kinds of grain. The first of these machines, which I observed, was a few miles above Yenzhou. At the first glance I thought it was a steamboat, and was greatly surprised. I really thought the Chinese had been telling the truth when they used to inform our countrymen in the south that steamboats were common in the interior. As I got nearer, I found that the steamboat was a machine of the following description. A large barge or boat was firmly moored by the stem and stern near the side of the river, in a part where the stream ran most rapidly. 2 wheels, not unlike the paddles of a steamer, were placed at the sides of the boat and connected with an axle which passed through it. On this axle were fixed a number of short cogs, each of which, as it came round, pressed up a heavy mallet to a certain height and then allowed it to fall down upon the grain placed in a basin below. These mallets were continually rising and falling, and the axle was driven rapidly round by the outside wheels, which were turned by the stream. The boat was thatched over to afford protection from the rain. As we got farther up the river, we found that machines of this description were very common. About 10 or 12 miles above Hangzhou, the country appears more fertile. The hills are covered again with low pines, and the lowlands abound in tallow trees, camphor trees, and bamboos. Large quantities of Indian corn and millet are grown in this part of the country, which is, for the most part, too hilly for rice crops. Our progress upwards was now very slow, owing to the great rapidity of the river. Every now and then we came to rapids, which it took us hours to get over, notwithstanding that 15 men with long ropes fastened to the mast of our boat were tracking along the shore, and 5 or 6 more were poling with long bamboos. When looking upon a river such as this is, one would think it quite impossible to navigate it, yet even this difficulty is overcome by hard labor and perseverance. The slow progress which we necessarily made suited my purposes exactly, and enabled me to explore the botanical riches of the country with convenience and ease. I used to rise at the break of day and spend the morning inspecting the hills and valleys near the sides of the river, and then return to the boat in time for breakfast. Breakfast over, I generally went on shore again, accompanied by my men, who carried the seeds, plants, or flowers we might discover during our rambles. The first thing we did on these occasions was to ascend the nearest hill and take a survey of the windings of the river with the number of rapids, in order that we might form some idea of the progress our boat would make during our absence. If the rapids were numerous, we knew that she would progress slowly and that we might wander to a considerable distance with perfect safety. If, on the other hand, the river seemed smooth and its bed comparatively level, we were obliged to keep within a short distance of the banks. Thus, day after day passed pleasantly by. The weather was delightful, the natives quiet and inoffensive, and the scenery picturesque in the highest degree. My Chinaman and myself, often footsore and weary, used to sit down on the hilltop and survey and enjoy the beautiful scenery around us. The noble river, clear and shining, was seen winding amongst the hills. Here it was smooth as glass, deep and still, and there shallow, and running rapidly over its rocky bed. At some places, trees and bushes hung over its sides and dipped their branches into the water, while at others, rocks reared their heads high above the stream and bade defiance to its rapid current. The whole country was hilly, and the distant mountains, varying in height from 300 to 3,000 feet, were peaked, ridged, and furrowed in a most remarkable manner. Altogether, the views were most charming and will long remain vividly impressed upon my memory. On the 29th and 30th of October, we passed the town of Qiantang, a place of considerable note. Opposite the town to Qiantang, there is a curious-shaped hill which is composed chiefly of granite of a beautiful greenish color, much prized by the Chinese. The slabs are used for various ornamental purposes, but they are more particularly in demand for the building of tombs. Large quantities are taken down the river to Yenzhou and Hangzhou for this purpose. The tea plant was now frequently seen in cultivation on the hillsides, this being the outskirt of the great green tea country to which I was bound. Leaving the town of Shangyuan, abreast of which we had anchored during the night, we proceeded on our journey on the morning of the 31st of October. After going a short distance, we came to a wild-looking part of the hills where there was a most curious and distinct echo. The boatmen and passengers amused themselves by yelling and uttering strange words at the highest pitch of their voices. These were taken up and distinctly repeated again and again, first by the nearest hills and then by others more distant, until they gradually died away. The Chinese have strange prejudices and opinions about this place. They told me that the spirits of men after death often chose to dwell amidst this wild and beautiful scenery, and they said it was they that now repeated these sounds and echoed them from hill to hill. As the day wore on, we came to one of those rapids which are so difficult to pass, and observed a great number of small boats waiting for and visiting all the larger ones as they came up. These were river beggars. Each of them had a very old man or woman on board, whose hair, in most instances, was whitened with age, and who was evidently in a state of imbecility and second childhood. They all expected alms from the boatmen who arrived from the rich towns of the east, near the sea. The Chinese, to their honor, revere and love old age. It was said that a celebrated English admiral was once in danger of an attack from the Canton mob, but the moment he lifted his hat and showed his gray hairs, they drew back and allowed him to pass on, unmolested. Be this as it may, it is certain that they revere and love old age and gray hairs. It was a custom with the boatmen every morning to set aside a small portion of rice in a bamboo cup to give to the poor. Hence, the beggars were generally successful in their applications. Indeed, it was a most difficult matter to get rid of them otherwise, for they were most importunate and even troublesome. We were visited by so many that the boatman often complained of his inability to give more than an ounce or two of rice to each, and appealed to them on the subject. But unless the whole of the contents of the bamboo cup was emptied into the basket held out, the mendicants made a great noise and complained that they had been deprived of their due. Sometimes the river was so shallow and so full of stones that the only passage for boats was close inshore. The land beggars knew these places well and always took their stations there. Each was provided with a basket suspended from the point of a bamboo pole, which he held out to the boatman and asked for alms. These landsmen were quite as importunate as their brethren in the boats, and were generally as successful in their applications. I was not aware until now that the lower orders in China, such as these boatmen, were so charitable. Few of the beggars, and their name was legion, were sent away without any alms. It might be that, ignorant and idolatrous as these boatmen were, they had yet some idea what a blessing would result from casting their bread upon the waters. Well, how was that? That was a lot of scenery to take in. The Daoguang Emperor, by the way, is in the last year of his reign of misery. All those foreigners. In getting to know Robert Fortune like we have, in these past 6 episodes, through his writing, we can get a sense of the attitude of many of these foreigners wandering around China right after the Opium War. Can you imagine? There were thousands of Robert Fortunes, and man, did they ever like bossing the locals around and complaining. Did you notice that remark Fortune made about these, quote, foolish regulations in Hangzhou, and how he intimated British military power should be used to sweep away these boundary lines and allow unfettered access to Hangzhou? Dang, times sure have changed, haven't they? Maybe you caught him quoting from Du Halde about the old proverb, Shang you Qiantang, Xia you Suhang. Heaven is above, Suhang are below. Remember Jean-Baptiste Du Halde from CHP 127, The Birth of U.S.-China Relations, one of the most listened to episodes of all time at the China History Podcast. He wrote the General History of China, published in 1735. In its day, and for a long time thereafter, this book was the most authoritative source about China that existed in the Milky Way, so far as anyone knew. This work will be featured later on once we get out of first gear here at the China Vintage Hour. Unlike Robert Fortune, Du Halde never actually went to China. But he did have a nice stable of Jesuits who had spent years in China during the glorious and spectacular reigns of the Kangxi and Yongzheng emperors. They were able to give Du Halde the inside skinny on late 17th and early 18th century China. That was interesting how these early logistics worked. Rickshaw pullers and boatmen who plied these roads of old China had to tie themselves to any number of hotel or shop owners who, for a percentage of course, would vouch for them as sort of a guarantor. In this way, someone in need of transport could safely hire men to do the heavy lifting. It's so interesting to get a little peek at how these things worked back in those days when communication was still moving no faster than the speed of a horse. But the railroads were coming soon. Well, not that soon, not till the 1880s. Chinese were building railroads in the United States before they were laying track down in China. Of course, however, they did catch up and creamed us later on. Well, more RF next episode. Tea lovers and lovers of tea history will appreciate this one. He'll be wandering through the green tea country of the Huangshan region in scenic southern Anhui, making all his professional observations. everything he sees is noted down or sketched in his journals. So his secret mission, carried out on behalf of his East India Company paymasters, will begin in the next episode. Until then, mis amigos, this is Laszlo Montgomery of the China Vintage Hour, and of course the China History Podcast and Chinese Sayings Podcast, all part of the Teacup Media empire. Feel free to stop by anytime and check us out at teacup.media. We'll see you next time for another old-time Chinese story here at the China Vintage Hour.